Hello, and welcome to the Natural State Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin. It is my belief that the natural state of any living organism is health, and that our artificial habitat has forced us into having artificial health problems. This show is my attempt to dive deep and learn about using nutrition, sleep, movement, relationships, and more to help you reclaim your natural state of health in a modern world and show you how to thrive in an environment that's stacked against you. If you enjoyed today's show, you can find out more details and information at dranthonygustin.com. Today on The Natural State, I welcome Dr. Greg Kelly. Dr. Kelly is a naturopathic physician. He is very accomplished and has a crazy amount of background. So he trained under some of the best. He also was a professor for a while. He has more than 38 journal articles that are indexed on PubMed. He has contributed to textbooks, etc. He is now the lead product formulator for Neurohacker Collective. And he is a sort of a mastermind in my mind. And these are the people that I respect because this is what I do a lot as well, is formulating products and thinking of, what are the inputs here I want to have happen? What are the outputs regarding a product somebody's consuming? And Doc here has a lot of interesting philosophies regarding his use of products, his recommendations. He's looking at how can you impact the optimization and brain health specifically with products and supplements and why you need them. So tune in and I hope you enjoy. This episode of The Natural State is sponsored by Ned. Ned is an incredible company that makes a lot of CBD products, and you guys can probably go back to some of my episodes and realize that I have been a CBD skeptic for a very long time. I think that it's really hard in this industry that's exploding to have really high quality products that actually do anything. I tried a bunch of different CBD brands before this one, and unless they had THC in them as well, not enough to get high, but just enough to amplify the effects of CBD, I didn't feel anything until I tried Ned and then was completely blown away. I'd been using their products before they sponsored the show for about 4 to 6 months and have noticed a huge increase the nights that I use their product, about 25 milligrams, so 50 milligrams per night of the CBD. And I sleep way better. But then also the most interesting part is my HRV, as tracked by my Oura Ring, the next morning is about 20 points higher the day that I use CBD versus not. I also have not been doing a lot of social drinking as of this year. So anybody who's been following my stuff knows that I've sort of been taking the backseat to any sort of glass of wine here, drink there, to take the edge off. And the last few months, I'm sure everybody in the world feels a little stressed out. And I've been doing the same amount, like 25 to 50 milligrams, to sort of replace that glass of wine to wind down and de-stress. And it's been pretty remarkable to pull down the edge and make sure that I can just calm down at night with all that's going on in the world. The founders are amazing people. They really care about their supply chain, their sourcing. They do things the right way. And I asked them to hook you guys up with a little bit of a discount code. So if you want to try Ned out, just go to helloned.com/AG15 for 15% off and free shipping. That's HELLONED.com/AG15. That's AG15 for 15% off and free shipping. This show is also brought to you by Alitura Naturals. When I considered sponsors for this show, I reached out to Andy, who is the founder of Alitura, and pretty much begged him to support the show just because they are the only products that I trust to put on my skin. So much garbage is in skincare products that it blows my mind. I cannot find any other products. I do not put anything else on my body other than Alitura. It's actually a lie. I use White Oak Pasture's beef tallow soap in the shower, but other than that, everything sort of pre-post around that is Alitura. And if you don't know why, your skin is the largest organ in your body. It absorbs everything you put on it. And men are less known for using sort of skincare products, but women average over 250 chemicals that are in their bloodstream from their skincare products by the time they walk out the door in the morning. That is ridiculous. I personally use the moisturizer the clay mask in my sauna, and the Pearl cleanser. My fiance uses way more. She has a little bit more of a skincare routine than I. And the products themselves are made with the highest end ingredients that you would ever find in skincare products. This stuff's incredible. Andy himself is a testament how these products work. He's been on the podcast before to tell his story, but it was amazing. He was in a horrific accident. His face got all mangled up, and he basically made this formula to heal his scars. And he is now a male model. That is not a joke. He has incredible skin and is obsessed with the quality of his ingredients and the sourcing of them. He was just in Hawaii recently sourcing one ingredient of the many that are in one of his products. This guy goes, visits every single farm and product, and it is incredible. The quality you get here is by far the best in the industry. And so I begged him to sponsor the show and also begged him to give you guys a little bit of a hookup. So if you use code AG20, you'll get 20% off in free shipping over at alitura.com. That's AG20 at ALITURA to get 20% off your order at alitura.com. That's AG20 at ALITURA.com. You get 20% off in free shipping of your entire order. Again, I use the Pearl cleanser and the moisturizer. They are phenomenal. Doc, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's super happy to be on your show. So it's nice with everything going on to have these social interactions.
Yeah, it's nice to connect to people remote as it may be. But yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people have had some time to hunker down and learn about a lot of stuff over the last few weeks. Some people just go to social media and complain a little bit, but yeah, I mean, I wanted to get you on to chat about some stuff and make sure people have the most up-to-date information as possible.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, in terms of background, I'm a naturopathic doctor, and I work as the head of science and formula development for a company called Neurohacker Collective. But really, with everything going on, we've been very focused on immunity, and especially immunity as it interacts with aging and cellular senescence. Those are terms that your audience would know.
Yeah, which is very important right now, I think. I mean, we're seeing that with a lot of people who are sort of succumbing to COVID-19. So I think a lot to talk about. Before we dive in, we'd love to chat a little bit more about your background. Obviously, you said you're an ND, but you have sort of a unique background as well. So, I mean, I'm just curious, like, what got you motivated to choose that path versus, maybe a traditional medical school route, and sort of what your path through healthcare has been like?
My path, even before that, was fairly all over the map. So I went to an engineering school and was an officer in the Navy. Was basically on ships and out at sea for the better part of 5.5 years in the Reagan time period. And towards the end of that, I had, just through my own interests, got into being a vegetarian, Buddhism, essentially a lot of things that didn't fit with being, remaining in the Navy. And when I first got out of the Navy, it occurred to me like I had never had a chance just to do my own thing. So my plan was to get rid of everything except what could fit in the backpack and just kind of be a gypsy and wander for a while. So my interest in health, at least in terms of natural health, emerged out of a selfish desire to be able to take care of myself as I wandered around. And I just viewed that a lot of the places I was interested in going, like Thailand, the Philippines, like less developed countries, that I would, if I knew more about traditional medicine, I'd be better able to take care of myself. So really that's where my journey into naturopathic medicine came, was just studying these things on my own and eventually finding out that there was a whole profession that was already dedicated to this in the US.
So did you get sick at all when you were traveling around, or was it just basically trying to improve and maximize your health?
I would say, I lived in Thailand at one point for 3 months, and I got like super mild traveler's diarrhea, but nothing that would have been persistent or even knocked me out for a day. But like there's maybe a very mild case, but even at that time, I was doing some Chinese herbs and probiotics to make sure that I was in as good a shape as possible.
Got it. And then as far as when you chose to go the naturopathic route, I mean, what sort of was the guiding principle that led you to decide that?
So really what ended up happening, I ended up, I had been in the Pearl Harbor in Hawaii at one point as an officer in the Navy, and ultimately ended up back there taking courses at the University of Hawaii. And was awarded a grant to do a master's degree. It ended up being on nutritional and medical anthropology. And during that time period, I was big into, doing and teaching yoga, meditation, and just plugged into the naturopathic community in Oahu. And really, I guess the best way to describe it is I liked their life. I liked, how they helped people. I liked, really what they were doing and how they were living their lives, and decided to pursue that on my own.
Got it. And as far as for people who aren't aware of the difference between naturopathic physician and, I guess, traditional medical doctorate degree, sort of how did those two things split off? And I guess, how do you perceive it?
So we would still, pre-med would be the same for both, with almost no exceptions. I think when I went, we had to have botany and a few things like that weren't part of standard pre-med, but otherwise those things were the same. And then they're 4-year schools. So the first 2 years would be, again, really similar, where you would do anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, neuroanatomy, like on and on. Really where it differs is when you start to get into treatment modalities. So we would spend a lot more of our 4 years on diet. We'd had classes on acupuncture and Chinese medicine, classes on Ayurveda, on all kinds of things to do with European herbs, but then homeopathy, hydrotherapy. Really, we would be the specialists on almost anything that would fit into that alternative or complementary medical umbrella. And so where I went to school at the time was Arizona, and each state has their own unique licensing laws for naturopaths. Some define a very narrow scope of practice, and some define a much broader. And Arizona, I believe, is the most broad of any. So we also learned minor surgery. We could get prescribing licenses and literally prescribe about 80% of pharmaceuticals as well. So Hawaii, where I ultimately ended up getting my first license, much narrower scope. So I eventually ended up practicing in Greenwich, Connecticut with Peter Diadamo, the blood type diet doctor. And Connecticut also had a much more limited scope. So in some states, we can do everything an acupuncturist, a chiropractor, and some like a physician's assistant would do. In other states, I'm much more limited.
Yeah. I think that you really put it in a succinct way, where you're saying like the first 2 years, roughly the same, but after that it sort of diverges and becomes a different discipline. And it's how you approach and treat and focus on really what you're going to treat as well. And I think that some of my doctors in chiropractic and the sort of slant, like you said, MD is more sort of your traditional Western doctor, where you're going to deal a lot more pharmacology and just general, like what you would go see a quote unquote doctor's office for. Like you said, a little bit more of a natural slant with a naturopathic doctor. Chiro is more so on the musculoskeletal basis. And some chiropractors, think that doing musculoskeletal work will fix other problems. Some think it's, you do musculoskeletal work to fix musculoskeletal problems, and then you can also layer stuff on top of that. It's like, that's a really good way to put it. I think a lot of people, if it's not an MD, they sort of are a little skeptical of the education. And I think that when you actually dig down into it, it's just, again, the science and the foundation is the exact same. It's just how do you treat, and what, diagnosis is probably a little bit different as well, but treatment in general, treatment paths are very different. And sometimes same person, presenting with the same thing can, maybe they do best with a Western model. Maybe they do best with an acupuncturist slant. And so I think that all of these things are worthwhile and I think very complementary.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I noticed in practice is the same thing does not work for everyone. Some people, acupuncture is a miracle, and other people it's a nothing. The same with a chiropractic intervention, or really anything. So I very much felt that the more tools I had available, the more people I'd be able to help.
Right. And so you said you bounced around from Hawaii, Connecticut, et cetera. Did you have your own practice, or sort of like working with different groups? How did that?
So I spent time with Diadamo in his clinic when his book came out around 96, Eat Right for Your Type. And that was about the time I was graduating. And at that point, I had just actually started my practice here in Southern California and was trying to build it. But I was a month in when he was very popular on the speakers tour, and ultimately he's a second generation naturopath, and so I knew some people that he knew, and saw him a few different times when he was speaking at conferences. And at the time, I was doing a lot of shows for Thorne Research, a supplement company. And he ended up just hanging out at the Thorne booth most of the shows when he wasn't speaking. And I think the second show I was at with him, he said something like, I don't really like many people, but I like you. What do you think about moving to Connecticut? And at the time, he had about a year plus waiting list because of the popularity of his book. So I just thought like, oh, that's a great opportunity. I'll get to see more much faster than I would ever on my own, and get to lean on someone that's, been in practice a long time and whose dad was in practice. So most of my practicing experience came directly from my time with him. And then in the time period after that, I did see some patients on my own. But since then, I've really been much more in the dietary supplement or corporate wellness world, or a combination of both.
Did you have a focus of practice when you went in with him? Like, how did that change over time? And like, what led you to the path that you are on now?
Well, even when I went to naturopathic school, I never went thinking I was going to be in practice long term. I guess the driving question for me has always been, what does health look like, and how do we then optimize it? So almost a biohacking spirit well before that was a term. And so I never actually viewed myself as being the doc that just hunkers down in a town and builds a practice for 10, 20 years. So I think I'm a restless spirit by nature. So every couple of years, I've tended to really want to tackle some brand new thing. And so life's afforded me the opportunity to do that. So.
Okay. And so how did you sort of like make you wrote a book, you published, or as an author on, 30 research articles. I mean, you had sort of a meandering path. What is your view on, like you said, how to build a framework on health and explain it to other people now? Like, what are the things that you look at as far as key markers of health?
I think, to me, the first and most important thing is our mindset around it. I guess, do you know the term mental models?
Yep.
So our mental models around health, I think, are ultimately the most important thing. And to put that in a frame of reference for the audience, so when I was, in my engineering degree time period at WPI in the early 80s, if you had asked me about medications and about health, my view or my mental model would have been really simple. I would have essentially told you something like, well, if I'm sick or something breaks, I'll just take a medicine and that will fix it. So that was about the depth of my understanding at that point in time. And then, that evolved through, in the Navy, since I was in good shape and cared about my diet, I was put in charge on both ships I was on of the people that had difficulty with the Navy weight standards and the physical fitness standards. And it was really apparent that, that it wasn't really like a willpower or fault issue of theirs, right? Like, the environment just wasn't set up for them to succeed with, sleep deprivation and shift work and diets designed to feed, 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day based on Navy menus that evolved during World War II. And so, slowly, my mental models around health now would be from a complexity science type of framework. So not even really naturopathic in a sense, but the idea is that almost that we understand health better based on the interactions between mind, body, and environment. And that when we fail to take into account any or all of those, then we're going to typically have a fairly naive idea about what produces health. So I guess my fundamental belief is there's almost two camps of people when it comes to health. One is that they want to control what's going on, and one that kind of trusts things and understands that their body's trying to do the best given the circumstances. So I fall in that latter camp. But most of the world, no matter what brand of healthcare practitioner you are, tends to be in that control. That if we just understand things better, will be able to do much better. And one of the things that I learned in my time shadowing some of the the old time naturopathic doctors, the ones that had been in practice for decades, is that they often took fairly general approaches to things, but those general approaches helped lots of things that you wouldn't have thought they would have. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you have any examples?
So like something like hydrotherapy, as an example, that's essentially the application of water skillfully, like what we would think of, now maybe in a biohacking sense of like, the alternating hot and cold types of things between a sauna. Well, there was old timers when I was still in school and just out that a lot of their practice still used hydrotherapy, and they would use it for everything from autoimmune diseases to infection to GI problems. Now, it wouldn't be the only thing they would do, but just that creating that resilience through the skillful use of hot and cold did a lot of good things. So when I was in school, there was already a movement within naturopathic medicine, the sense that we needed to understand every aspect of biochemistry and do this to block this and this to upregulate that. And in a sense, that to me is almost like fool's gold, because the things we thought we knew in the mid 90s, we know so much more now. And a lot of those things we knew back then are wrong now. So we're like core principles. So, you've done a lot, obviously, with diet. I think, one of my mentors in diet was very much a Price Pottinger type of guy, like Weston Price's work. Primal diet, I think, would be what we would call that now. But the truth is, one of the things Weston Price found when he went around the world in the 30s looking at indigenous diets was that there were lots of diets that kept people like robust and healthy that had little in common with each other than that they didn't eat really processed foods, okay, and that they did eat what was, like whole foods from that they could produce in the region they lived in. So I think that, that a lot of times we get fixated that there's only one way to do things. And the truth is, there's probably many paths, but they share common principles. So I'm much more a principle focused guy at this point in my career.
Right. So, I guess the general principle is that with the body given the right environment can flourish and become healthy, and there's not a lot of intervention beyond the environmental factors that need to be done. Is this correct?
Yeah. I think it's varies. So, but I would say, yeah, like my, I guess the metaphor I would use with a patient, and this goes back to a game that existed in the 60s when I was a kid. It was called the camel game, or maybe the last straw, or, I think it went by both. But basically it was a plastic camel, and there was buckets on each side with different colored straws that you would put in. And each straw, the blue one might weigh more than the red one. And you spun a little compass, and whatever color it landed on, you had to add that straw. And at some point, the amount of straws in the basket outweighed what the camel could support, and it broke the back. So that was kind of the gist of the game. So my I guess analogy for health is, I think we're all like that camel. We can carry different loads depending on what we've done up to now, our age, our environment, lots of factors go into that. And then we all are carrying at any given point in time a bunch of straws, some that we can do something about, some like EMF, maybe we can't do much about. And so the goal is to make sure we're below the threshold, ideally comfortably below.
Right.
Because once it breaks, that's when the disease happens. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And so, it's sort of like this concept of like an allostatic stress load of like, you can basically handle so much until systems break down. So, in your experience, what are some of the things? It's obviously very relevant now, given the pandemic we're in and seeing what people are getting sick and what people are dying the most of. I think it's people who have most of this load, who are probably carrying a lot of the straws and are maybe already broken, if not close to being broken. So, some of the things that you mentioned, really easy to modify, some of them not so much. So, what are some of the like largest ones that you see are pertinent to people adjusting their health?
I think Hans Selye, the person that coined the idea of stress, he was of the belief that mental emotional was the biggest, what I would, in my analogy, straw. So I would tend to agree based from my experience in practice. So that one, if we can deal with things in that world, that typically will remove a lot of weight. But diet is obviously huge, as I'm sure exercise. In general, aging just weakens the back so much that, anything we can do to essentially make ourselves healthier as we age is going to make us able to carry the bigger the load. And, what's going on now with the SARS-CoV-2, like the virus causing COVID-19, is it's disproportionately affecting, in terms of poor outcomes, the less healthy and the old. So with that, we know those populations have certain things in common that are making them less able to deal with the burden. And then, in general, the idea of viral load, I think, will probably, play an important role in this as well. And that essentially is, if we are getting exposed to the virus, how much? I don't know what your experience is with allergens, but
since I moved to Austin, it's crazy. I mean, the allergies here are nuts.
Yeah, and to me, like, allergies are like a total load kind of thing. Like, we can, if that load is kept below a certain threshold, which is going to vary individually, then we typically, won't experience symptoms of allergies. But if we, go past that threshold, especially if we go way past it, then allergies are just going to be brutal. So, like, I'm always thinking of that idea of, like, how can we lessen the load and how can we make the camel's back stronger? And I think ultimately, when it boils down to it, for me, health is about doing those two things. And depending on the individual, the exact thing you might do could, maybe change a little bit. But in general, the big picture things we're going to all share.
Right. So as far as general principles that you were talking about before with food, and I totally agree with you that, when you're looking at it, I don't really care if somebody's carnivore or vegan in general, as long as they're eating local, seasonal, real food. And then I think you can optimize there to get what you need as an individual. Different things are going to work for different people, but I cannot accept an argument that packaged or processed food is beneficial. And you said that sort of the biggest lever around reducing these stress buckets was emotional and mental. So what are some principles or mental models that you have there regarding ways to think about approaching the world to keep those in check?
Well, one of the things with the mental emotional, and do you remember a movie, Courage Under Fire, with Denzel Washington, late 90s?
No.
Meg Ryan was in it. Matt Damon. So anyways, basically the background of this movie was Denzel Washington's character at the beginning of the movie is the CO in charge of a tank unit in, I think was probably the first Gulf War time period. And he actually gives the order that ends up blowing up his buddy's tank because of, like, the kind of cloud of war. And the setting of the movie is he's not allowed to share that information. He's basically told he can't share it with, this person's family, even how he died. And so he becomes an alcoholic. So as a way basically to just give him something to do, they have him investigate this death of, it's the Meg Ryan character who died, a heroic death. So he's really just supposed to interview the people and rubber stamp it so that she'll get the posthumous medal. And as the movie unfolds, we find out that the 4 survivors all have their own health thing. So he's got alcoholism going on. One of them we find out is a heroin addict. Another has stomach cancer, which, like, the metaphor for me is something that you can't digest, right? Something eating you up inside. A third, ultimately commits suicide. And what we find is that the story they told about how she died and how she really died were completely disparate. Essentially another cloud of war thing, but one of her guys shot her and killed her. And so for me, the metaphor there is congruence, right? There's what really happened, and then there's what we're telling the world happened. And while I'm sure it wasn't intentional in the movie, what happened is in each of these cases, there was a huge gap in congruence and then a huge health consequence because of it. And so one of find find incongruences and, remove them. So if there's something that, I guess, like in a simple sense, we both agree that eating McDonald's isn't bad. But when I was in my mid-20s and a vegetarian, I think it would have affected me much more than my brother that was 17 or 18 at the time that really thought McDonald's rocked. Right? Because I'd have been eating, the processed bad food along with it being way more incongruent for me, if that makes sense.
Totally.
So that's a biggie to me, is that incongruence. Another one is that I tend to think of bandwidth being a really important thing for mental and emotional, because our brain can only do so much at a given time, right? Like the brain is the biggest user of energy. It uses about 20% of the energy that our body makes every day. And if we're consuming a lot of that with low-level background stuff, like the equivalent of having a lot of software or apps up on our phone at the same time, then it's just going to work less efficiently. And so what, my experience is a lot of people have all kinds of things chunking up that space, many of which would be shut down if they just made a decision on something.
Right. So sort of like the concept of like open loops.
Yep.
Right.
So like I learned, by my late 20s, if something was really ruminating about, consuming a lot of that bandwidth, that I needed to do something about it right away.
Okay. And do you see that? Yeah. Have you seen that in people manifest in physical health problems, or is it sort of like this ambiguous cycle where it goes from that to stress, and the stress can sort of like have very, wide ranging effects on physical health? Or how do you view it as far as how it impacts somebody's like actual physical health?
So I think it, like how the pathway works, I couldn't, tell you, because I don't think that any of us would know that for certain, but for sure.
Or that it's important, right?
Right. Yeah. And so like, in the mental emotional, those are just things we can do for ourselves. If we can, detect an incongruence, do our best to, align our behaviors and what we say with what, we believe. And if there are, things that are running in the background, they can be simple things, right? Like most people that I worked with over the years will just have a lot of little things like, oh, geez, I have these clothes. I'll probably won't, wear them again, but I'll just hold on to it for now. Like anything that we haven't made a decision on and we will free up some bandwidth. And when our brain has more bandwidth, it just seems like a lot of good things happen, both in terms of our, mental performance, but also how things perform in lots of other areas. I think it's one of the reasons why meditation or just breathing exercises carry into so many diverse areas of health. In a sense, when we're, engaging in that practice, we're at least temporarily freeing up a lot of bandwidth.
Yeah. And one of the things that I do sometimes in my meditation as well, like when I feel super overwhelmed, and this is something that I've learned to do over, 6 years plus of meditating pretty regularly, is, and I have like different tools for how I meditate and different sort of like what I want to get out of it. And if I'm feeling super overwhelmed, I'll clear my mind out and sort of like relax and get into it. But I'll also have a notebook next to me and sort of just like wait to see what thoughts come up that are basically open loops. And then I just make a list of things and then address those at a separate time. But basically let my subconscious come to the surface and say, hey, dummy, you forgot about these things. And that seems to, and then doing that and then actually taking action and closing those loops is something that I do pretty frequently. And so I don't know if you have any experience with that, but it's something, I guess, just a personal anecdote.
No, I think that's awesome discipline.
Yeah. This is something that's super interesting. I've in my work have really had this concept of closing open loops just to increase mental performance, but didn't really have the concept in my mind of how that can impact health and stress levels overall. So it's interesting.
I think stress is such a nebulous word that, I think stress is, I think the stress experts have typically said, it influences probably 80% of illness. I certainly wouldn't disagree with it, but stress can be physical, mental, emotional, all kinds of things. So really another one of my mental models is that essentially everything is a stressor. It's just a question of
Right.
Whether that stress is acting to toughen us up or we've exceeded our ability to deal with it and it's being counterproductive. But like I would view, something like resveratrol, right? A compound found in grapes as something that actually induces stress. The reason that resveratrol in both human and animal studies, I think has been shown to do so many different things is because it's the response to the stress that, that's causing that toughens us up and allows us to deal with all kinds of other things as a consequence. The same with intermittent fasting types of behaviors or even exercise. All of those things are stressors. So again, my mental model would be that everything is a stress.
Right. And it's just like I think that what's lost on a lot of people is that our exposure to stress now is essentially infinite and made up by our environment, whereas the environment in the past for hundreds of thousands of years of our human history has been dictated and pretty much predictable. And so, as a hunter gatherer, you're walking around like you have 100+ generations behind you that all sort of like had the same problems. Wisdom was passed down. It's sort of a fixed amount. Even when we were talking about food before, the environment was going to give you the food, whatever is local, whatever is seasonal, whatever you could get. Whereas now, even looking at food and the choices you have to make, what's in your fridge, what you should get, what you should mix with that, when you should eat it, et cetera. The sort of the mental bandwidth problem, I think, is such a factor of our modern society, overwhelming people, whereas before it probably just wasn't even an issue.
Right. I mean, for sure, like our ancient ancestors, stress would have been much more pulsatile in general, right? Right. Where now we have all these things that are chronic that are really never removed from the camel's back. And we can do much better, at least Selye's work showed that we could do much better or predicted we'd do much better when stress was more pulsatile than when it's ongoing. So the same, I guess the analogy would be, tires, whether you're rotating, right? If wear and tear happens and the more, consistent wear, causing that wear and tear, the quicker something's going to wear out. And that, we all wear out somewhat differently and unevenly. So, stress doesn't affect every part of us the same, right? We all have an Achilles heel that's going to bear the brunt of it.
Right. And so now you sort of switched into formulating a lot of products. So this is obviously a very different slant. And I think that I took a very similar path as you, and made some products, made some companies that I think were very helpful at teaching people how to think about health and their body and help them out in a very different way than sort of traditional practice, due to just sort of digging down the rabbit hole, like you mentioned before. But just curious in your perspective regarding a lot of the products that you have developed regarding, is this stuff that we should have gotten in our normal nutrition in the past that we're not getting now? Is it stuff that's, supplemental as the name goes? So it's just, providing the ability to have peak performance, or how do you think about these products that you develop?
I think, I'll take products aside and just talk about just individual ingredients to start. But I think, so if we were to take vitamins, minerals, an amino acid like choline, really those we need as much as we need, right? There's going to be some biochemical individuality there. And the chances are, someone eating an impeccable diet might get all of that stuff, everything they need. But an impeccable vegetarian diet or vegan diet is going to probably be low on creatine, choline, vitamin B12. So you could be eating an impeccable diet and still be running a shortfall in some really important areas, just because that diet's not designed to really fill the tanks with that ingredient. So, anything like that, I think it's important to do our best to always keep the tanks full, right? And at least as close to full as possible. And that's often a lot different than the dose, so creatine as an example. Bodybuilders have used creatine for 25 or 30 years, often will initially dose it really high and then do a maintenance dose of maybe, 5 grams a day. But the one study I saw, and this was in women that were, I want to say they were vegetarians, but it's possible they were vegans, but it took much less of a dose of creatine every day to not only refill the tank, but keep it full. And that was, they used a gram a day. And so often what we need to keep the tanks full is a lot less than, the doses that are used. And I'm not a more is better guy. I'm an adaptation guy. Like that idea of everything to me is a stress. If we're taking, I guess have you heard of the Yerkes-Dodson law?
No.
So it's essentially think of an upside down U, right? It's an adaptational curve. So if you think about your first drink, the first time you have alcohol, very little alcohol is going to really knock you for a loop. But if you continue drinking, you'd eventually be able to adapt and drink more and more. But at some point, you'd peak. Your ability to metabolize alcohol would be used up, and you'd start to essentially, for less alcohol, be more and more inebriated. Okay. And the far end of that is, down in the gutter alcoholics, 1 or 2 drinks and they may black out, right? They've literally used up everything. Exercise is another thing, right? We know, like, if we start a new exercise program, performance is going to improve. We're going to go up that, that upside down U. But if we don't do the right, or, have the right approach to exercise, we're going to peak and then overtrain eventually. So that like your Gustin would be the name of the law, that adaptational law. And the idea is that the bottom is time, right? So given enough time, we're going to go through that curve. And in my model would be in everything. What dictates how fast we do is the dose or the intensity. So if we ran a marathon every weekend for the next 6 months, most of us would have, well before that time, gone into overtraining, right? We'd have been harming ourselves from the exercise. If we decided to, walk every day, we may stretch that timeline out for more than a lifetime. So to me, I'm always thinking about that intensity. And with supplements, intensity is dose. So the higher the dose we do of something, the more compact that time period before we, essentially might run the risk of overtraining to that ingredient, if that makes sense.
Right. And do you think about this as far as pretty much all supplement ingredients, or specific ones for specific pathways or purposes, for instance, like neurochemistry, et cetera?
I tend to think of it with everything. I don't think that, like I said, I'm not a more is better. Right. And a lot of nutritional studies are a relatively short duration. And I remember, so complexity science is one of the things I said I was super interested in. And that is the science of complex adaptive systems. So this idea of adaptation. But really we know with something like caffeine, receptors adapt to that pretty quickly. If we don't do things to, periodically desensitize them or, resensitize them to caffeine, that you often need more and more caffeine to get the same effects. Vitamin D is interesting because I've seen a fair number of smart people recommending high doses of vitamin D as a general strategy for immunity in what's going on right now, right? Which, I know that there's been at least 25 random controlled trials of vitamin D for upper respiratory tract infections, so your normal colds and flus, right? So it's super well studied. And in 2017, someone did a meta-analysis of those 25 studies. So basically a study of studies. And, they concluded a couple things. One was that taking a really large dose of vitamin D every once in a while was actually not good for preventing colds and flus. It actually seemed worse than doing nothing. So it seemed much more important to take a lower amount every day if you wanted to get benefits. So that's cool, right? So that's, something we can take action on. But the other thing was that they found that the best, the lowest risk for colds and flus actually occurred at the lowest dose of vitamin D, something akin to the daily value, the RDA, around 600 to 800 IU a day. And that once you got up to about 5,000 IU a day, your odds of getting a cold or flu were the same as doing nothing. So, there was other things they found in that study, but they clearly found that more wasn't better, and that how we dosed it mattered. And so, to me, when I formulate things, those are core things I'm always looking at. Like, what does the evidence show? What's the evidence show, over a week, but what did it show over the course of 6 months? Because it takes time to adapt. Did they compare multiple doses in a study? Because what often happens is a lot of these studies are sponsored by the company that's making that branded ingredient, like the vendor that the vitamin company would be buying from. And so they want to sell you like more, right? That's in their best interest. So one, there's not a ton of studies where they compare multiple doses, but quite frequently when there are, they follow almost like the 80-20 rule, but often even more amplified, where almost all the benefits occur at the lowest dose that they studied. And they'll recommend the highest dose because there was marginal, additional benefits. But like my adaptation model is that if you can get most of the benefits from a lot lower dose, that's the way to go, because ultimately we want to make sure we're doing something more like walking than running marathons.
Got it. So do you think about it at all from like like you mentioned before, in the past, we had more of a pulsatile stress response. Do you think it's like sort of like lower dose, acclimate, then sort of pump the brakes and take a break and then go back on, or sort of lower amount, adapt, stay there for a while, sort of like the walking everyday approach?
So I'm much more of the former. So my typical thought process is unless you have to do something every day. So, like you're on insulin or thyroid medicine, then it's better to approach it like exercise and do, so my general recommendation with our products is do them 5 days on, take 2 days off. And then every quarter, maybe take a week or two vacation, just to almost the equivalent of a deloading week in exercise.
And that's just for cellular stress response to be pulled back a little bit, so that way things can repotentiate when they get reintroduced again. So it's something that's like taking a break from caffeine every now and then.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. And I think for most things that fall in the supplement world, that's a better strategy to take. That would be my opinion anyways.
Interesting. And so then when you think about formulating a product, I mean, we have obviously a lot of different class of substances you could use, but I mean, that goes even for vitamins and minerals in food. I mean, which would sort of like piggyback a lot to fasting, for example. Fasting is a built-in mechanism to have natural reduction in vitamins, minerals, et cetera, antioxidants, whatever. You're looking at the same thing supplementally.
Yeah, like antioxidants. Well, one, I think that term's used, non-specifically, but the classic antioxidants, the vitamin C's, vitamin E, those at least, I think Ristow is the researcher's name, but those things are counterproductive when done, too much, especially with trying to get the benefits of exercise. Because part of the exercise is essentially the signal to adapt. So when I think of, say, weight training as an example, when we lift a heavy weight, our muscles, so this would go back, I guess, to my naive view when I was younger. When I was in the Navy, I thought I got bigger and stronger, during the lifting, but really we get bigger and stronger after the lifting because our brain and body are predicting we might lift again and they want to be better prepared. That would be the complexity science, interpretation of it, right? Okay. So, which actually matches reality, right? If we don't give enough rest and recovery, we don't improve. We don't get the benefits from the time we put in at the gym. So that time period away, that contrast. So the same with, do you know the fasting mimicking diet? Walter Longo's work. Yeah. Prolon is the brand. So I've spoken with them a couple of different times at the A4M conference, the anti-aging conference. And one of the consistent themes when I've heard them speak publicly and when I've asked them questions is it's that refeeding time period after coming off of that fasting mimicking diet where a lot of the magic occurs. So we need both. We need that time period of, some kind of fasting behavior, but then we need that coming off it as well. So I'm a big fan of creating contrast whenever we can.
Got it. And then, so you guys do that with products you have, as far as some products are on, some products are off, or is it just basically take one and then take a break from it?
No, our general recommendation for all our products is to do a 5-day, 2-day on. That's, obviously you can individualize that if you'd like, and then periodically take a deloading time off from it. We've just found, especially with nootropics, which is the initial product we have, that's that seems like the most useful way for people to continue to accrue benefits over long periods of time.
Right. And I love you guys' formulations, especially the nootropics. What, when you went through, did you focus on sort of the building blocks of making a product that you have now?
So for that one, for the nootropic stack. So Qualia was the name of that product. Really, we wanted to do a whole bunch of different things, but to get, for most nootropic users, what they want is what I would think of as how does the whole system respond? So they care about, their focus, their motivation, their ability to keep distractions from, making them less productive and things that fall into that world. And I guess my analogy, like what you'll usually see in like essentially medical diagnostics, is that they put brain function into 6 big buckets. So one of those is attention, one's memory, one's essentially think of it as like visual motor reaction speed. Language is one. Another big bucket is social cognition. So that's empathy and, our ability to do anything in the social world. And another one are executive functions. So of those, I tend to think of them like a pyramid. So the base of the pyramid would be, for lack of a better word, being alert, being awake, so more than any legal substance, caffeine does that, right? That's the thing it does better than everything else, is it induces that vigilance, which is super good because we can't get higher up on the pyramid if we're not alert. Like everything else is off the menu. And then the layer above that, you start to get into what they call the attention bucket, complex attention. So that's, your ability to focus, to avoid distraction, things like that. Caffeine also does great there, but it does even better when you stack it with theanine, a compound that's found in green tea. It does even better when you start to add in enough choline that we've topped off the tanks. And choline, I've seen the Institute of Medicine estimate that something like 8 out of 10 adults don't get enough in their diet.
Interesting. Yeah, and choline for me specifically, I did a genetic test and I was found to have lower than normal choline production. And I've supplemented and tested this and even tried to get a lot of my diet. And for me, supplementing with alpha GPC is always the best route for me personally. So I don't know if you have opinion on me doing it right or not, but
no.
Yeah.
Alpha GPC, I think is, of the different choline forms, that one's great. It's very bioavailable for the brain, and it's got the most choline per weight of any of the other choline sources. So alpha GPC is also, interesting because it's been studied a couple times now in humans for exercise, and it seems to also fall into that ergogenic category. So something that improves sports performance, which makes sense because some of the same compounds our brain uses, our muscles need. So creatine, which has been, a big ergogenic substance for decades, as it turns out, is, one of the better nootropics. And alpha GPC, it's gone the other direction, right? It's been something that's been thought of as a nootropic for decades that now we're understanding also really helps muscles.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that part. It's fascinating. Okay,
yeah, so those two worlds are going to increasingly blur. Right. And I think part of it is because of what I mentioned, like our brain uses pound for pound or ounce for ounce much more energy than any other tissue in the body. So, things that help our, actively used muscles are going to be helping the brain and vice versa.
Right. And as far as, this stuff has been studied quite a lot, but I think that a new sort of realm that's coming out a lot, that's becoming very popular, is anti-aging supplements, especially with, NAD, upregulate NAD with, nicotinamide riboside, NMN, compounds like these that people are selling for really ridiculous prices, saying, take a bottle every single day and you'll live forever, sort of thing. Curious in your thoughts around these compounds in general and the benefits are merited, and what products do you think? Obviously, I think that you guys have done something in the space, but just generally, the single ingredient anti-aging supplements that are out there right now.
So nicotinamide riboside, I'll just say NR to keep it easier, and the nicotinamide mononucleotide NMN. Those are essentially newer vitamin B3s. So vitamin B3 is the vitamin that makes NAD. And so right. the core thing that we care about is NAD. So NAD does 3 different things. 2 have been known for a long time. The other is much newer, which is where all the excitement came from. So One of those is it's involved in making ATP. Another one is NAD, once a P is added to it, a phosphorus, is involved in antioxidant defenses. So those things have been known about for a while. And if those were the only reason NAD was important, we wouldn't need anywhere near as much vitamin B3 in the diet to do well as we do. And the comparison would be riboflavin, vitamin B2, which is also involved in, essentially it's very involved in that same ATP generation. And if you look at the amount of RDA for both of those, you'll notice that vitamin B3 is way higher. So why is that? And the why was answered when they found really this third thing that NAD is used for. And that's almost as if it's food to activate different pro-longevity pathways. So one is sirtuins, which are really maybe the master regulator of our stress responses and metabolism. Another one is PARPs, which are involved in DNA repair. So each time that NAD is used to activate those pathways, the molecule is broken apart. And what's left over would be niacinamide, so one of the older vitamin B3s that's then recycled to rebuild NAD. So that's called the salvage pathway. The other older niacin or B3 is called niacin, the flushing vitamin B3. That builds NAD in a different way, but it also builds it, and the tryptophan builds it as well. So those are the three ways to make it. Now, I'm sorry, NR and MNN are newer things that are in that salvage or recycling pathway. So they're proposed to be more efficient ways to make it than niacinamide would be. So that's the gist of it. That's kind of their story. And what they've done is initially shown in a bunch of animal studies that when you gave high doses of it, that it did a bunch of what we would think of as anti-aging, like some very cool things metabolically. So one of the interesting things to me about those studies is quite a few of them, they dose it by injecting it. They don't give it orally. So one of the concerns with taking those things orally, and this has been known since the early 90s, is that we have enzymes in our... I'm sorry?
Is this a liver processing or what?
No, digestion. Like we have things even in our saliva that start to break down NAD. So most of the vitamin B3 activity in animal products is going to be in NAD molecules or NADP molecules, like the whole molecule. And what we ultimately absorb and gets to the liver is the niacinamide. Like we break that stuff down. So that's been known, like I said, at least since the early 90s, maybe before that. So NR and NMN aren't new things. They've always been known as like things that in reverse order get made as that NAD molecule in food is broken down. Now in plants, most of the B3 activity is going to be like more in the niacinamides. They're not going to be in the whole NAD molecule. So anyways, that has been looked at, and what they do in science for something like NR as an example, think of that as two different molecules, nicotinamide or niacinamide is another way to say it, and riboside. So they'll put an isotope, they'll radio label each of those molecules and then trace that through the body. And if that double labeling, if those two isotopes end up in the same tissue together, it's pretty likely that the whole molecule made it there. And so what they have found so far when they've done these double isotope studies is that none of the whole molecule makes it past the liver. And, a lot of it doesn't even make it to the liver, which matches the earlier research showing that it's largely broken down. So to me, these are very expensive ways to essentially get niacinamide past the liver.
Right. Which is not that expensive of a molecule comparatively.
True. And then the other thing, and this would be more in the concern, like we've known niacin, the flushing vitamin, B3 has been used in really high doses for cholesterol for decades and decades, right? And so we know it does a good job in lowering it, but it also comes with side effects, right? Insulin resistance and things like that. Can even damage the liver at the high doses it's sometimes used at. Niacinamide in high doses does the same in terms of it can cause some degree of insulin resistance. And again, getting into this more is better theme, to date in the human studies of NR, the animal benefits haven't translated in the human studies. So they've looked at, insulin and cholesterol and triglycerides, and it's essentially either done nothing or at high doses made triglycerides worse in one study. So it's done kind of what you would expect high doses of niacinamide to have done.
Interesting.
So I think, to me, it's much better to, give lower amounts of those things. But then what ends up happening, since I said this is a molecule that's used in 3 different ways, is supporting those 3 different paths from there. So you want to not just give super high doses of, any of these vitamin B3s, but you want to help the body recycle it, essentially reuse it over and over as it needs it. And that's something that I think is much better done with polyphenols and plant compounds.
Right. Which is why I like how you guys formulate stuff in general, which is more so providing supportive substrates for pathways rather than trying to force a mechanism to happen just one time.
Right. And then the other thing is, do you know that how we eliminate? So again, this would have go back to my naive viewpoint. I would have just thought like, geez, if I took too much vitamin, my body will just, not use what it doesn't need. But it takes work to get rid of that stuff. So the way we get rid of excess niacinamides, vitamin B3s, is by methylating them. So that's betaine as an example, which is in the choline family. Choline can also be used as a methyl donor. But what happens when we do these high doses, and even doses much less than that, is we start to really tax the methyl donor system.
Right.
So we deplete betaine. So if you are taking high doses of any of these vitamin B3s, the newer or the older ones, I think it's important to also at least consider taking betaine. And I believe it's Chris Masterjohn recommends doing 1 milligram for milligram. So if you're taking 250 milligrams of one of the vitamin B3s, doing 250 milligrams of betaine, which looking into it myself, I think that's a pretty prudent recommendation.
Yeah. And how would that go for somebody who's getting like an NAD push, or doing some of these IVs where they're getting this stuff intravenously?
Well, if they're only doing it once in a while, I wouldn't be concerned. It's doing it every day that I think you're going to start to really deplete. Like acutely, I guess I always tend to think, there's a difference between you do something acutely or once in a while versus every day. Just like I tend to think there's often a difference between what you do to prevent getting sick from something and what you would do once you got sick with that.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot to pull through in this episode. I think we'll probably wrap it up there and just sort of, I think that there's a lot to think of when, I guess, formulating products, but also, there's a delicate balance of nutrition and nutrients in general, and there's a lot of wisdom in food. But yeah, this is why I think that people need to do the research. And I know that you guys put out white papers regarding why you formulate stuff and what amounts, and I really appreciate that. But yeah, if you could point people in the direction of, I guess, where to find your work and anywhere you want to send them.
Yeah. Neurohacker.com is our website. We, like you said, we put white papers about our products, but we also write blog articles about different topics and post them there. You can also follow us on Facebook, though that tends to be more our social media outlook and less about, the sciencey kind of things. And then I did want to just comment, getting back to, what are we deficient in the diet? The one thing I would say, like, I'm fairly confident that we're very deficient in, unless we're supplementing, would be polyphenols. And so if we've got a minute or two just to discuss that.
Yeah, sure. So
polyphenols are, what are called plant secondary metabolites. So they're not used by plants for energy like chlorophyll. So resveratrol, which is found in grapes, but other plants as well. Quercetin, which is, found in the, really heavily in the outer layers of onions. These are all polyphenols. And in general, polyphenols are thought of as plant defense compounds. They're things that when, pests are nearby, the plant will make more of. Like with resveratrol, if, the sun's hotter or if the climate's drier, they'll make more. Essentially, they're the ways plants say, okay, things are going to be tough, I better toughen up. And when we consume polyphenols, it tends to do the same thing. It's why, they tend to have really broad actions, almost adaptogenic actions. And if you think of like our ancient ancestors, their food supply would have had to be tougher, where our food supply, so we could be eating the same plant, but the chances are ours was grown in a very unstressed environment. So that plant wouldn't have made as much of those polyphenols.
Right.
That makes sense. So, my, thought at this point in my life is that a lot of the population would do much better by getting more polyphenols.
Got it. And the best way to do that?
Well, we can eat more fruits and vegetables, but often where they concentrate, like quercetin, concentrates in the parts of onions, like that outer skin layer that we throw out. So, I think supplementing is really the way to ensure we're getting both more and a variety, because similar to, the recommendations for fruits and vegetables that we want variety, the same to me would be true for polyphenols. We don't want to just go, hog wild on one polyphenol. Right. We want to get a variety in much lower amounts. Which is what we would have done in the past for hundreds of thousands of years, huh? Yeah. All right, Doc. Well, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on the show. Well, thanks for having me. Have a great rest of your day. You too. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.